Welcome to the Chicagoland Guide, and I'm your host, Aaron Masliansky. Today we are sitting down with Adrian Brizulea. Adrian is from CoStar. He is basically the maven on commercial real estate in the Chicagoland area. And I got the pleasure to hear you on stage over at the Chicago Association of Realtors Market Outlook event. Thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Aaron. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. So you have a background in economic development we were talking about, and I looked over at your bio. We are a fellow Illini alum. And I don't know if your program that you did, I was in urban planning, but you did planning, but was that in the business school?
No, I went to the School of Planning, but I specifically focused on economic policy when I was during my time there. There was a newer concentration that they had opened up, and just given some of the internship experience that I had with the city of Chicago, I knew I wanted to go that route. It's awesome. And actually, I took a class, P357 with Rob Kowalski, the land development process. And that's what kind of confirmed that I wanted to be within the real estate world. I knew I wanted to be within it in some capacity. I didn't really care what at the time. I wanted to get into development at first, made my way around there. But yeah, that's really what, that course kicked off my interest in the field.
That's really cool. Back when I was in school, I think you're a little bit younger than I am, but I interned for the Village of Morton Grove in their economic development departments, got to learn a lot about it. It's a whole nother realm of planning and everything that goes on. And I think a lot of it is knowing what the businesses are doing and what is important to them. So I'm sure that's factored into what you're doing now. From that degree, you went on to JLL?
Correct. After graduating from the University of Illinois down in Champaign, I've continued at UIC, got my master's there in economic development. And while I was in grad school, I was working full-time with the city of Chicago in the 10th Ward under Alderwoman Susan Sadlowski Garza as an economic developer. Got some experience there. And once school wrapped up, I went over to Kretschmer Associates, which was at the time was a small consulting firm up in Evanston that primarily focused on market and feasibility studies for prospective affordable and senior housing developments, specifically those that were seeking LIHTC credits in the 4 and 9%. Got my hands dirty in real estate there, confirmed that I really wanted to do housing, and then from there I went to JLL. And I was at JLL for 3 years on the capital markets research team, focusing on multifamily investment sales, as well as the debt and equity placement teams.
What years were you there at JLL?
I was at JLL from 2022 to 2025.
That must have been an interesting time to be there with everything that was going on. 2022 was still kind of COVID, and the markets were just changing so much. What were some of the things that you were seeing then?
Yeah, so in 2022 was really interesting. It was really hard to write a good story about Chicago or defend Chicago. There was, all the headlines were property tax and crime. And by the time I left JLL, that had entirely shifted. There were still concerns about property tax and crime, but the fundamentals for Chicago were so great that investors were looking past it, and we had a lot of interest. But in 2022, it was really interesting because all the Sunbelt markets, so think the Phoenixes, Austins, Nashvilles of the world, they were exploding. They had a large supply boom. And they were getting rents or seeing rent growth anywhere from 8 to 15%.
Oh, wow.
And then you had Chicago, whose rent growth was sitting around 1.5 to 2%. So we were kind of like the ugly duckling at the time. But one thing that I learned from that experience was that slow and steady wins the race. And at the time, I didn't see it. And one of the brokers that I worked for, Mark Stern, he would explain to me, "Don't worry about it. This will all balance out. This will normalize. We have to, what we have to show within the data is that this is consistency. Chicago isn't a trend. It's consistent. We're well insulated because we have a diverse economy. The headlines are population losses, but where is the population growing? It's growing in the urban core. Where do we sell buildings? Mostly in the urban core." It was a really good learning experience for me. And so it made me a better researcher. It made me get creative with the data to understand how to tell a better story that focused on trends over a long time, as opposed to trends that were maybe quarterly or annual. If you take a look now, those Sunbelt markets are in the negative rent growth territory. They're still working through that excess of supply that they saw. So if you take a look at the percent of inventory under construction from 2021 to 2023, Chicago peaked at around 3.2%. The national average during that time was around 5.5%. And then you had your Sunbelt markets that had anywhere from 10 to 15% of their inventory under construction. So once all that inventory delivers, it takes some time to absorb. No matter how much population growth you have, there's still lease-up phases. You still have to incentivize occupancy in some way, which is typically through concessions. So you offer a free month of rent. You'll offer an air fryer, a 55-inch TV, a wide range of things to incentivize occupancy, which at the end of the day does affect bottom line rent growth. It affects your net operating income. It affects the overall value of the property. Very interesting to kind of see where I started as a researcher to where things are now, because it's a totally different world.
And why did those markets slow down so much? I know you're saying that there's a lot more building and capacity that went there, but aren't people still moving there? And I know that in certain markets, building slowed down because interest rates went up, but did that not affect the Sunbelt states the same way that it did here?
Yeah, so two things. A lot of people were working fully remotely. So there was I think the trend now is hybrid work. At the time, a lot of people said, hey, I don't have to be in the office. I'm going to move to a warm state.
Sure.
So that was, yeah, neither do I.
It's going to be negative 15 here tomorrow.
Yes, that wind hitting my face walking around today makes me reconsider.
Yeah.
Yeah, but those trends slowed as the world kind of stabilized and normalized. I think everything that we saw up until from 2020 to 2023, in my eyes, an anomaly. Probably won't see, not repeatable, something that you maybe won't see again. Maybe one of those 1 in 100-year events, to put it that way. So the population growth slowed as people had to be more tied to a physical location, go to the office. Even if it's once a week, it's a bit tougher to make the case to move elsewhere. So that population growth slowed in that way. And then additionally, a lot of those developments, interestingly enough, had floating rates. So the debt tied to the either construction or the construction loan or the actual physical asset are not consistent. So interest rates go up, and now there's an imbalance there. So I think one way you have to view this is, hey, if interest rates change, either go up or down, can I still make money? And you'll see a lot of deals in the Sunbelt markets that seem like home runs in 21 and 2022 that are head scratchers now, just because the change in interest rates, the debt service increased, and it's no longer as viable or feasible to build at that capacity.
Do you see things where, what we experienced in 2007 to 2010 or so, where these large buildings might be going under because the debt or the interest rates went up so much and they can't refinance, or they're not getting the rents that they expected?
I don't think we'll see it at the rate you saw it in 2007 to 2010. There's going to be some instances, but for the most part, I would say the overall status of the debt is relatively healthy. There are some challenges. You're going to see some sales at a loss just because some of those investors need to just look at cutting their losses there. But I don't think you're going to see that widespread foreclosures or trouble with that.
Yeah, that was something else to experience firsthand. I was working on condo developments, and we were doing things in Chicagoland area and in Arizona, and it just came to a crashing halt, and you knew that something was wrong, and there's nothing really you could do about it.
Yeah, condos are interesting because there's still some condos now that are selling at a loss in comparison to when they delivered in 2008 to 2010 or before that.
Yeah.
I think an athlete's condo is currently being posted. I forgot, a hockey player. I forgot exactly who, but it might have been Hossa. I'm not sure. But his condo's up for sale for less than he acquired it for. Interesting.
Yeah, it's a shame. And at the same point in time, I have clients that are looking for condos and would love to have something new, and there's not much going on, especially in the suburban markets. But in Chicago, what we're looking at, I want to talk about all the different markets that you cover, but in Chicago, in terms of rent growth, we are seeing that now because things have been consistent. And we did have a slowdown in how many units were being built because the interest rates popped up so much. But what are you seeing now? And Chicago, it seems to be pretty healthy, right?
Yeah. So for the last about 7 quarters, almost 2 years now, Chicago has been a top 5 leader across the major markets for rent growth. And again, that's just due to not overbuilding coming out of the pandemic, a very consistent level of supply. Chicago is, performing well from the rent growth standpoint. As it relates to supply, we currently have just shy of 10,000 units under construction. So that's about 1.6% of our total inventory that's under construction. If you take a look at the national rate, that's around 2.7%. And then if you slice the top 25 markets, they're sitting at around 3.2% of their total inventory under construction. So Chicago is still relatively undersupplied. We did see construction activity tick back up in the second half of 2025. We saw about nearly 4,000 units added to the development pipeline, which kind of did boost our total inventory under construction. Prior to that, we were at our rate was around 1.1 to 1.2%. So a decent shift. But even then, those projects, those 4,000 units that we added to the pipeline in the back half of 2025, likely not going to deliver to market until 2027 and 2028. So 2026 is going to be an extremely supply constrained year. We're expecting between 3,700 and 4,000 deliveries. And that's about a 20% drop off from the 5,500 or so that we saw in the previous year. 2024 and 2025 relatively consistent as it relates to deliveries. Saw between 5,000 and 5,500 The drop off this year is about 20% decline. But yeah, the 2020, this year is going to be the kind of the most supply constrained.
And do you think that demand is going to continue with everything that's gone on with immigration since the Trump administration took over? It seems to be that there's been negative net migration in the United States. Is that happening within the Chicagoland area too? And does that affect what people might build or what rent growth will be?
Yes. So we're going to see demand decelerate slightly. We're seeing it now. But so two things. The demand is going to continue to outpace supply. At least that's what we're forecasting. But demand is decelerating. In previous years, our absorption was very strong in 2023 and you can attribute that to the population growth in 23 and 24. We surprisingly, contrary to the headlines that you see about Chicago all the time, we added about 100,000 residents across the entire Chicago metro, and a big portion of those were due to foreign net migration. But that's a trend that we don't forecast to continue just due to federal policy getting a bit stricter on that.
Sure.
We don't expect that population growth or that injection that we saw in 23 and 24. We are forecasting a bit of a slowdown in demand and similarly a slowdown in rent growth, and that's both nationally, locally, and nationally. Currently, the rent growth rate across the nation is around 0.3%. Chicago's at 3.3%, so we're outpacing it notably. But we are forecasting for the entire country that's going to remain relatively flat throughout the entire year. You're going to be bouncing around between 0.1 to 0.3% through the end of 2026. And we're forecasting a deceleration for Chicago to about 2 to 2.5%. That's a decent deceleration, but if you compare it to the rest of the nation, still performing relatively well.
Yeah, that's good. One other thing, too, is these new executive orders about housing and not allowing large corporations to buy houses for renting unless it's a specifically rental community. Do you think that will have a big impact on the Chicago metro area?
I don't think so. It's a very big headline, but if you break it down, and I think Jay Parsons does a really good job of breaking it down. If you take a look at some of his most recent posts on LinkedIn, he talks about what the actual impact is of institutional investment in single-family homes across the United States. And I believe they're only about a 4%. They're 4% of the market share, so it's not too much. And then I think some of the definitions aren't fully there yet. So I don't think institutional investor is clearly defined yet as it relates to this policy. So I don't think we're going to see the outsized impact that the headline kind of suggests that it may.
Yeah. I see just from my own work in residential, there were a lot more homes that were owned by some of these large companies like Invitation Homes. They bought a lot of houses out of foreclosure in the early 2010s. And I see that most of them have sold already. So I don't see it as like a big impact. Certainly there's investors who want to come in and buy things that need to be flipped, but that's more so like your mom and pop type of companies that I see doing that rather than large companies, at least in the Chicago area. I hear that it's more so like in Tennessee or other markets that are different than what we have.
Correct. And I think if you take a look at the data for institutional owners from 2008 this way, they're net sellers at the end of the day. Correct. Just as you mentioned, they're not holding on to these long term. They came in, bought them at a massive discount, probably flipped them, rehab them, renovated them, flipped them. Yeah, I don't think we're going to see the outsized impact that the headline may suggest.
Yeah, I think it makes for good headlines.
Yeah.
And then one of the things that I actually had written about and had been a big topic was the lack of demand for office space and about converting a lot of these office buildings into residential, especially like in the Loop. And the city of Chicago is providing money to do some of these projects. Do you see that continuing? Has demand picked up for office space? What are you seeing in there?
Yeah, I'm sure, a lot of people are aware about the LaSalle Street Reimagine initiative, trying to convert about 2 million square feet of office into about 1,800 residences, 30% of those which will be affordable. I think there was just an announcement yesterday for another building that was approved. That's going to start becoming a factor. Our two companies already started on 79 West Monroe, so that's underway. And then there's some additional buildings that are set to break ground or start the reconversion process in 2026. We likely won't see those kind of make an impact or get delivered to the Central Loop until 2027 and 2028. I do see the office to residential trend emerging even stronger in River North. So outside of those 6 massive projects that you're hearing about as a part of LaSalle Street Reimagined, there's about 450 or so units underway in River North that are former office spaces that are going to be converted to residential. And that's just because of the overall built environment for River North. So if you take a look at a lot of those office spaces, they're your lofty office spaces that are a bit easier to convert from the floor plate perspective as well as overall livability perspectives. They have windows across the entire buildings, across the entire floor plate, and just a bit more easy to convert at a more economical cost. So River North is definitely picking up as it relates to those conversions. As it relates to demand for office space, that's been the tricky one.
Yeah.
So we're currently market wide, we're sitting at around 17% vacancy for office. That's slightly more than the national average. I think nationally we're sitting around 15.5%, so a bit elevated. But we are seeing demand return back to the traditional corridors within the urban core. Any office along Wacker is seeing renewed interest. And there's actually a small shift away from Fulton Market. Not that people don't want to be there, but the market's kind of frozen. There's not as much space available within Fulton Market. And if you're in the market to move, I think the general feedback that companies have gotten, landlords especially, is that Fulton Market isn't too accessible. And from a transit perspective,
Sure.
Only the pink and the green lines service it. Still a great submarket, great area, but if you're going to be having people in 3, 4, 5 days a week, they probably want something they can get to without having to cross a highway when you're walking from Ogilvy.
Yeah, it doesn't sound pleasant.
Yeah, I think that crossing the highway creates like a big mental block or hurdle as it relates to the distance. Again, not far from Ogilvy or Union Station, but having to walk those extra 10, 15 minutes in comparison to getting off at Clark and Lake, which is serviced by every transit line in the country. Or sorry, in the city, is a bit more.
You got Amtrak, so it is the country.
Oh, yeah, you're right.
What would you say is, if you were an A-plus type company and you wanted to locate in Chicago, where would you go?
I would likely go to the traditional West Loop submarket. So somewhere along Wacker Drive, probably try to be on the river. And if you take a look at the data, the premium for riverfront properties is notable. You'll see approximately a 10 to 15% premium for office buildings that are along the corridor of the river. I would locate there, but personally myself, I love the view of Lake Michigan. So I love the view of Maggie Daly and Grant Park. As a former employee of the Aon Center, I used to spend a lot of time daydreaming out those windows. I think for my personal interest, it would probably be like the new East Side, but from an overall feasibility, accessibility, kind of overall building quality, I would probably go somewhere along Wacker Drive in the West Loop.
Yeah, that's and near like Sears Tower and everything over there too.
Correct.
What does office space rent for per square foot over there?
So it just depends, but you're going to be anywhere from the $30 to $55 a square foot range. There's some office spaces that are creeping up into the 60s. The way we break it down, we actually have, if you take a look at Class A/Trophy, we break it into 3 tiers because there are notable differences within Class A. So if you take a look at your premier trophies, you're going to be in that $52 to $60 a square foot range, and then it decelerates from there. If you take a look at your signature buildings, they're going to be anywhere from that $40 to $48, $50 range. And then you're going to see the A to A minus buildings be anywhere from that $30 to $38 range. So yeah, that's where they line up.
And how does Chicago compare to, say, Manhattan or downtown Los Angeles? Like, where would you say are the other premier office locations in the United States?
Oh, Manhattan.
Or globally, like London or...
Yeah, Manhattan really blows out the water in terms of a square foot. I don't think you're finding anything in Manhattan under $70 a square foot just for standard office space. And that's where our signature is. LA is a very interesting office market because their office space isn't necessarily concentrated within the downtown submarket. The suburban office space is
It's premier
over there. Yeah. So you'll see like a lot of that low rise 3 to 5 floor business park office space in LA in different areas. So it's tough to pin rents specifically in LA when their downtown isn't the premier office submarket.
Sure. And what do you see though, like in the suburban markets, or you talk about like office campuses and things like that? I know that there's been a lot of changes over the past 10 years in these large offices in the Chicagoland area. You had Sears, that campus is being redeveloped. Allstate's being redeveloped. Baxter, I don't know where that's going right now. I know that they were trying to change that too, and Walgreens in Deerfield. So there's a lot of different campuses, or even McDonald's coming into the West Loop. So what's the prospects for that? What's the status of these things?
Yeah, so I think in terms of the kind of demolitions / conversion for the suburban office parks,
yeah,
I think what is going to be converted or demolished or raised has been announced. As of right now, we don't see anything like on the horizon of big announcements in terms of these major plans for former campuses. We are just generally seeing a shift for, those suburban spaces. Those suburban spaces are, those business parks are really good candidates for flex office space, flex industrial space. So for example, you like Takeda, the manufacturer that just announced, their move to the suburban campus. Their appeal there is that they can have lab space, they can have office space, and they can kind of have like just a bit of R&D space as well.
And then during COVID, there was so much building of warehouse space because everybody was just buying tons of stuff. And we needed places to store it and have it delivered. Has that slowed down?
Oh yeah, that slowed down specifically in Chicago. And that's a direct result of economic policy, specifically as it relates to tariffs. So Chicago is really dependent on the flow of goods from both the ports, both on the East Coast and the West Coast. So when you see imports and overall container shipments decrease in those areas, you're going to, at the end of the day, you have to either put those on a train or put those on a semi-truck and get them back to the center of the country for distribution. So when those import flows fall off, there's a direct correlation to demand for transportation, distribution, and logistics space here in Chicago. Currently, all of 2025, we saw a deceleration in demand, specifically and mostly tied to our transportation and logistics sector. For Chicago, no news is good news as it relates to economic policy. I think we're finally hitting a point where we're stabilizing. We saw the brunt of the demand losses in 2025, barring any unforeseen headlines. Yeah, who knows? But as it currently stands at our current pace of absorption, we have about a 5-year supply overhang. If we're to continue to take up space at our current rate, it would take 5 years to occupy all the warehouses. Nationally, that figures around 2.3 years. So we have a considerable amount of space out in the market. But Chicago is the biggest industrial market in the nation, about 1.4 billion square feet of industrial space. Around 70% of that is tied to transportation, distribution, logistics. A big player, but I think we should see a stabilization kind of moving ahead, barring any crazy tweets or headlines.
Who knows? Everything can change on a dime, and that's why it's so hard to be able to plan for these things. So people were building like crazy, and then all the policies shifted, and they could shift back again too. It's hard to plan if you're owning real estate, that's for sure.
Correct. But what's interesting is that newer warehouses are in high demand. The warehouses have the adaptability for kind of technology as it relates to manufacturing automation. Because I think overall, kind of just the way that we're storing things, you're going to see a demand for taller buildings, higher clear heights, more doors, higher doors as you get into these buildings. So a lot of the vintage space that was built in the 70s and 80s is not necessarily suit for the current needs and demands of the transportation, logistics, and warehousing world. So at the end of the day, you're going to see you're still going to see a shift towards some of that new supply, just from an overall accessibility and logistics standpoint, because you need that the way the industrial world has shifted, specifically with automation.
Yeah, because with automation, the systems know how to get to things that are even higher up, and being able to use robots in order to be able to get it, as opposed to these older buildings where you had to rely on manpower to be able to figure these things out.
Correct. And for example, even if you're not stacking something all the way to the ceiling, you still have fire codes that you have to abide by. The inspectors will come in, and even though you're not scraping the ceiling, you need X amount of feet between the sprinklers and your product, so that in case of emergency, the sprinklers could effectively work. They're running into situations where they just need to move because they're not going to shift the way in which they stack this or how they store the product.
Sure. And another thing too in this space are the data centers and everything that's going on there. So that, I feel like you keep reading headlines about new data centers being built throughout the country. Is that also something that is affecting the Chicagoland area? And is that taking up some of that space, or is that completely built to suit?
Most of the data center space you're going to see is built to suit. Chicago is very interesting as it relates to data centers, because if you take a look at most major metros across the U.S., or just most markets in general that are developing data centers, you'll see that most of them are concentrated along the outskirts of the metros and the suburban areas. In Chicago, they're geographically everywhere. There's a conversion taking place right now in the Loop in downtown Chicago. That's being converted. You're seeing some movement in Northwest Indiana as it relates to data centers, as well as in the just northwest of the O'Hare submarket. Data centers are geographically kind of spread out in Chicago, which is relatively unique. You're not seeing that level of geographic diversity in other markets.
Does it even matter where they're located? Do they just need to be close to where they can get electricity?
Correct. The real estate right now is power. Power constraints are the biggest, what's just hampering overall just growth of the data centers. You need access to power. And I think ComEd just released a statement that they won't be able to meet the current power demands within 3 to 5 years. So if you didn't apply 2 to 3 years ago, you're stuck in line right now.
Why don't these companies just build their own power plants? I know that some of them are, but are they doing that in Chicago?
Yes, but that's actually a good question. I think the overall cost to building that is relatively inhibitive, but That's a good question. I think that would make the process a lot easier. But at the end of the day, they still have to hook up to ComEd. So ComEd has to be able to meet their needs.
Yeah. I remember a few years ago when everybody was talking about getting the grid ready for electrification of cars and all these other electric buildings, whatever it may be. And it wasn't really talked about the data centers for AI. It just wasn't on anybody's radar. And that is what's driving everything, because they're spending so much money on these investments that it's blowing anything away.
Correct.
Yeah. I think also, like, when I look at the suburban markets and you look at some of these shopping malls that are just dead, like Northbrook Court or Lincolnwood Town Center, and Old Orchard, thankfully, is doing pretty well, and it's going to go under some redevelopment too. But do those large areas pose potential for some of these other types of uses? What are you seeing in that space? Because I feel like a mall makes a lot of sense, especially when it's going to be super cold out, to be able to be inside and go shopping, but consumer habits have changed.
Yeah, malls aren't entirely dead. They are shifting in a sense. If you take a look from a demand perspective, so I think rent growth is the number one kind of metric that kind of bakes in vacancy, demand, supply, a little bit of everything. Malls lagged all retail types for rent growth. Surprisingly, not negative year over year, where they're sitting around the 1% territory compared
Zero times zero is zero.
Yeah, compared to the broader retail market for Chicago, it's around 2.5%. But as it relates to what you can do with malls, I think the kind of the mixed use concept is pretty popular. Focused Development just delivered the first phase of Luca in the second half of 2025, which is one of their first big redevelopment projects. And
where's that located?
That is located, that's Luca Fox Valley, the former Fox Valley Mall. I think the concept for malls, or kind of like the game plan moving ahead, is, mixed use districts. So they'll probably have some retail, but, not hundreds of thousands of square feet. You're not going to have anything big box. You'll probably have something, think more traditional, maybe neighborhood center, power center, strip center retail, as opposed to big box. But again, supported by higher density of residential. And I think when you have 500 units of residential that are surrounded by retail, you have a direct consumer base right there that allows the retail to perform a bit. There's built-in demand, there's foot traffic that is already built in. I think that's kind of the shift, repurposing these spaces to be maybe 75% multi and 25% retail as opposed to 100% retail.
Yeah, and even I was in Arizona recently, and they're stopped at a Whole Foods, and it's basically the anchor for this large apartment development. And I feel like that's what we're seeing in all these different places, where certain businesses are always tying to these large apartments because they naturally feed each other, but it's not a huge, big shopping center.
Correct.
Yeah. I could see that happening a lot. Like at Northbrook, I would think would be a perfect opportunity for something like that. But the best retail you were talking about in your presentation are these strip centers.
Correct.
Why is that? You wouldn't think that necessarily if you're not in the space.
Yeah, so the two reasons. Number one, just generally the services and the tenant base of strip malls are just services that can't be replicated or duplicated online or virtually. So think your hair salons, nail salons, coffee shops, cell phone repair stores, tanning salons, smaller experiential fitness users, so like a smaller yoga studio, Pilates studio, etc. And all of those they require they require foot traffic, and they'll feed off of each other. If you go to a workout, chances are you may grab a coffee afterwards or beforehand, whatever the case may be. If you stop at the dental office, you're likely going to walk past some of those stores and maybe stop in and buy something. And just generally, as it relates to just the box size, strip malls are just a bit more conducive to that because the smaller nature of the box size. So
sure.
Typically 2,500 square feet and under, but is going to be like what comprises your strip centers, which are performing extremely well. But just generally across the nation, we're seeing those 10,000 square feet and below performing or outperforming the rest of the market.
Do you see a lot of new development for those? Or is there capacity for that?
No. So retail development around Chicago and the nation is very subdued. In Chicago, there's just about 1 million square feet currently under construction as it relates for the entire retail market. And that's about 0.2% of our inventory. So not much at all. Nationally, there's about 0.4% of the inventory currently underway. So we're relatively undersupplied from a construction standpoint. It's actually helping us out a little bit. The closures that we saw in late 2024. So think your Joann Fabrics, Party Cities of the world, the Big Lots, those had a big impact in Chicago. There was a notable footprint of those companies across the entire market. So all of last year, in 2025, we're working through those closures, backfilling those spaces. A lot of those were backfilled by gyms. So think your LA Fitness, Planet Fitness. They were the number one candidate for those backfills. So the pace of construction is actually helping us out. And the reason why construction is so slow is just challenging capital markets, just due to rising interest rates that's put a hamper on construction activity, rising material costs, and rising labor costs. That's all contributed to retail development not being, the rents just don't pencil right now for considering the kind of quick rise in costs.
But I guess my viewpoint, it looks like an opportunity, but if it's not penciling, then it's not an opportunity.
Yeah, it's just not penciling as of now. That's going to force a lot of the existing strip centers to remain more competitive. If things aren't being built, people are going to go to whatever space is available on the market. So you're likely going to see a lot of strip centers undergo significant renovations to just remain competitive with the existing stock out here.
Yeah, because it's already there and it's entitled. You don't have to go and find new land.
Correct.
Yeah, and I see that all over the area. Communities really have challenges to be able to convince businesses to come and invest into their area. So the city of Chicago obviously has a lot of money behind their economic development. Real Business Chicago, they're the big dog in the area. The suburbs, they all have economic development coordinators or directors. You worked in that space. I interned in that space. We've seen it. It's hard, and they're all basically competing. So what do you think works? Because I see a lot of times, like, I've been very involved with Skokie and Evanston. I've seen what they've done. There's different types of tax increment financing that they could use, different types of business district grants, and they could work with developers to be able to get financing set up. But what actually works and gets the momentum going to really get a town center to be successful?
Yeah, I think speed is what works. I think a lot of deals die due to time. So if the local planning department, economic development department has the ability to, number one, review permits quickly, if they have the ability to just correspond with the prospective tenants very quickly, I think that's what helps get most of these deals across the finish line. The timing kills everything. Like, investors do not want to wait 3 to 6 months for a review period, and they come back and the city says, hey, you need 2.5 more parking spaces after a 6-month review. So I think overall speed is just what helps the most. Trying to get this out reviewed and approved within 1 to 3 months, that really helps.
You think that's even more important than some of these monetary incentives?
I guess they
go hand in hand.
Yes, but the thing with monetary incentives is that there's two sides of it. There's two sides of the fence. You're gonna have your group that doesn't want to see the incentives handed out to prospective tenants to try and facilitate these deals, and then you have the other group that says, hey, this doesn't pencil without public subsidy or incentives. So I see both sides of it. I think they do work in a sense, but it's a little controversial by geography.
20 years ago, I worked for a developer, had a plan approved by the planning commission, and went to the city council, and it was rejected. So he basically had to completely redesign the project, which changed everything. It slowed things down. And by the time things got going, it hit the 2007, 2008. And project died like midstream. I mean, half of it was built. So if you had the speed and certainty, then you can get these things off the ground much more quickly and make the market while it's there.
Correct. And that also adds to your soft costs. For example, having to go back and redo the plans. You have to pay the architects again. You have to pay the engineers again. That adds up over the course of time. At the end of the day, your soft costs go into your total costs, and you have to bake those into the rents. And who's going to pay the rents? It's going to be the tenant, and that gets passed down to the consumer. At the end of the day, if you can reduce your soft costs with speed, with efficiency, that's a big factor.
Yeah, certainty is key, and eliminates some of the risk. Now, if somebody's looking at the Chicagoland area overall compared to other markets, tell me why somebody should go and invest in Chicago.
Yeah, so from a multifamily perspective, I would say that if you compare us or put us up with the rest of the gateway markets, affordability is our key. And that's here in Chicago and the Midwest. I think all the Midwest markets are currently getting their 15 minutes of fame as a result of affordability. But if you take a look at the gateway markets, we're about 30% more affordable than the average in terms of rents. So the average for gateway rents is just shy of $2,800 in the Chicago market. We're around the $1,900 mark. So that affordability is a big factor. And in Chicago, we do have consistent demand. Everybody that goes to school in the Midwest likely dreams of landing their job in Chicago, living in the big city, which is a consistent demand driver. I don't see these institutions going away anytime soon. And there's a significant amount of schools in the Big Ten. You have solid demand drivers. And then I think just overall, Chicago's remained consistent. Despite through all the peaks and troughs, we've never overbuilt, we've never overreacted. Chicago's remained consistent. If you zoom out and take a look at the data, you'll get a very solid picture. And I think in other markets, they're very cyclical and more exposed to some of the swings. During the highs, it's great. During the lows, it's a bit tougher.
Yeah. And also, we have so many major projects at the Market Outlook. We have Realtors Chicago there, and they're talking about all the different things that were happening, from Quantum to O'Hare to all the redevelopment around the United Center. I think there were like 20 different things that he mentioned, and those are all demand drivers and an endorsement of the city of Chicago.
Correct. Yeah, I think as of right now, there's six cranes in the sky. There's 12 cranes approved. So by the end of 2026, there should be somewhere around 18 cranes up in the sky, which is a massive demand driver. The one I'm most excited for is the quantum computing facility down on the former U.S. Steel site. And as a resident of the southeast side, that's something that I've passed every day to get to school, to work. And, it's been sitting vacant for quite some time now. So, really exciting to see that kind of take off. And, I think I'm dating myself a little bit now, but when I first started my professional career, that was the plan for that was the Barcelona housing project. So that was going to be a couple thousand residential units. They were going to try and make it kind of like a smaller mixed use district. Those plans have come and gone, but very interesting and exciting to see the quantum movement heading that way. There's actually still a kind of a mock-up figurine model right near the U.S. Steel site, right off 87th and South Shore Drive, where the former U.S. Steel employees used to go clock in and out of work. That's kind of like a smaller office space. That's like a museum now. And they actually have a kind of a mock-up of that model figurine for the couple thousand residential units. Pretty cool to see what could have been there. But
I remember going in 2004, I was at an American Planning Association convention, and they had an option to take a tour of different developments around Chicago. So we went there. We went up to the Glen when that was being built in Glenview, a bunch of other places. But I remember going through that site, and so when I hear about these new projects in 2026, it's like, all right, let's get the shovel in the ground and actually build this thing. And what's so interesting with quantum is that nobody knows what they're really talking about. It's nebulous, and it's what kind of jobs are going to be there? What is actually happening here? And I just want to see it go up so that way the people can see it and it's real, and then that will drive a lot of demand. You're a resident of nearby that area. What do residents feel about that, though? Like, what? I know this isn't necessarily about like the data and things that we've been talking about, but what's it like being there where you're being discussed that there's going to be these major projects going on for over 2 decades and then nothing happens? And like, how does it feel like, what about everything we have going on here already? Tell me about that.
Yeah, there's a mixed bag of emotions from the local residents. I think the concern is that the development won't benefit the residents of the community. There's a big push for a CBA, specifically from the local environmental groups, the Southeast Environmental Task Force specifically, who is seeking a CBA that'll ensure that there's some benefits to the residents. And then you have the other side where people are just excited that this land is finally going to be something. It's been sitting vacant since late 80s, early 90s, and the area was heavily impacted by the steel mills packing up and leaving. A lot of thousands of jobs lost, and you can see that reflected in the South Chicago community. So there's a mixed bag of emotions, but ultimately I think some progress is better than none.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that this is a thing that will be great for the entire region.
Correct.
Once it actually happens. Yeah, and we need these types of businesses and industries to be able to remain relevant as time goes on, because things are changing. It seems like rapidly. Yeah. I think that anyone listening, I think you've gotten a good sense of what the Chicagoland market is like and all different factors within the real estate market and all the things that drive what's happening here. Is there anything else that you want to leave us with?
Let's see. I think there's some exciting times for Chicago ahead. There's a lot of demand drivers that are going to probably reshape the city, urban core, entire metro as we know it. I'm really excited to see Google kind of occupy the Thompson Center.
Oh yeah.
I can't wait to walk in there and just see what it looks like from the inside. If Google does end up moving those 2,000 residents into the space, that's a really good tailwind for just overall, just the economy of the urban core, specifically in the retail aspect. Any submarket that has Loop in its name has availability rates. So think of what's vacant plus up for sublease between 23 and 28%. Those 2,000 employees plus all the people that come to visit, they can really provide a big boost to the local retail economy. And then you're going to have hopefully 1,800 units residential paired with that within a quarter mile, third of a mile radius. That can be an additional 3,000, 3,500 residents. So an additional 5,000 people that are driving foot traffic to the loop is going to be significant and monumental. And we have movement on every side of the city. I think for a long time, the people say, oh, everything's just concentrated in the downtown area. Now youth movement on the south side, you're seeing movement in the downtown urban core. You're seeing data centers go up, but just even north of O'Hare. So there's movement all across the entire city. And I think there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic and excited for the next 5 years here in Chicago.
Yeah, I certainly am. And I think this is great. Adrian, thank you so much for your time today and for sharing your wisdom with the audience here. And I look forward to hearing you at the next Market Outlook and reading everything that you're preparing so I can remain educated and advise my clients and people I know so they can make good decisions.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you, Aaron. I really appreciate you having me on today. It was a blast. And yeah, looking forward to continue and learning about the Chicago market and diving into it.
Sounds good. Thanks so much.